The October air bit at Laura's cheeks as she hurried down the quiet street. She pulled her jacket tight around her, trying to block out the sharp chill that seemed to cut right through the fabric. The wind whipped through the nearly bare trees, stirring dry, crinkling leaves and sending them skittering across the pavement like tiny, erratic footsteps. She shivered, not just from the cold, but from the eerie stillness in the air. It was Halloween night, yet the streets were oddly silent. No children were trick-or-treating, no laughter echoed down the sidewalks, and no houses glowed with the soft, warm light of carved pumpkins. Only the occasional porch light flickered, offering a fleeting sense of normalcy in a neighborhood that should have been alive with excitement. Laura glanced at her watch. It was just after 8 p.m., a bit late for trick-or-treaters, but the night felt unusually deserted. She quickened her pace, eager to reach the Miller's house. Tommy and Sarah, the Miller's 2 young kids, were already tucked in bed, or so Mrs. Miller had told her on the phone. It should be an easy night of babysitting, watch TV, maybe read a book, and wait for the parents to return from their Halloween party. No big deal, Laura reminded herself. Yet as she approached the Miller's house, her stomach twisted. The house loomed at the end of the street, large and dark against the dim evening sky. Its Victorian-style architecture, once charming in the daylight, now felt imposing and eerie. The tall spires and intricate woodwork cast jagged shadows against the pale moonlight, and the narrow windows glimmered faintly, barely lit from within. The house seemed to stand apart from the others on the street, isolated in its own world. As she walked up the driveway, the gravel crunching under her feet, Laura couldn't shake the sense that she was being watched. She paused, glancing around, but saw nothing, just the empty street stretching out behind her. She scolded herself for being jumpy. It was Halloween, after all. Her mind was just playing tricks on her. Still, as she stepped onto the porch, she hesitated, taking in the heavy wooden door and the shadows that clung to the corners of the house. Taking a deep breath, she rang the doorbell. The sound echoed inside, faint but sharp. A moment later, the door creaked open, and Mrs. Miller appeared, a warm smile lighting up her face. "Hi, Laura. Thanks for coming over tonight." Mrs. Miller greeted her, stepping aside to let her in. Laura smiled back, grateful for the warmth that immediately surrounded her as she crossed the threshold. Inside, the house felt more inviting than it had outside. The living room was large but cozy, filled with plush furniture and soft lighting. Still, it seemed almost too quiet, too empty, like something was missing. Laura couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the sense of unease lingered. "The kids are already in bed," Mrs. Miller explained, handing Laura a list of emergency numbers. "They've had dinner and should be fast asleep by now. You'll probably have a quiet night." Laura nodded. "Sounds good. I'll keep an eye on things." "Thanks again," Mrs. Miller said, squeezing Laura's arm. "We'll be back around midnight. If anything comes up, don't hesitate to call." With a final wave, Mr. and Mrs. Miller disappeared into the night, leaving Laura alone in the vast, quiet house. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that clung to her. "It's just a job," she reminded herself. "An easy one. Just sit and relax." She wandered around the spacious living room, taking in the antique furniture and shelves lined with old books. The house was beautiful in its own way, but there was a heaviness in the air, like the silence itself was pressing down on her. She tried to ignore it, settling onto the leather couch and flipping through the TV channels. A classic horror movie was playing, one she'd seen 100 times before. It seemed fitting for Halloween, so she left it on, trying to lose herself in the familiar plot. But as the movie played, she found it hard to concentrate. The wind outside picked up, howling against the windows, and every so often, the house creaked, as if it were settling into the night. Laura's eyes kept drifting to the dark corners of the room, where the shadows seemed to shift ever so slightly. She told herself it was just the flickering light from the TV, but the uneasy feeling gnawed at her. She glanced up at the ceiling, imagining Tommy and Sarah asleep in their beds upstairs. The house was so quiet. It was almost hard to believe anyone else was there. About an hour passed, and Laura had just started to relax when the sharp ring of the phone shattered the calm. She jumped, her heart pounding in her chest as she turned toward the old-fashioned landline on the table beside the couch. Who could be calling? The Millers had a cell phone, and if something were wrong, they'd have texted. Maybe it was just a wrong number. Laura hesitated for a moment before reaching for the phone, her fingers brushing the cool plastic. "Hello," she answered, her voice steady but curious. For a long moment, there was only silence on the other end. Laura frowned, listening closely. Then, just as she was about to hang up, she heard a low, steady breathing. Her heart skipped a beat. "Hello," she said again, her voice firmer this time. But no one answered. Just the breathing, slow and heavy, like someone was standing just out of sight, watching her. Laura hung up quickly, her hand trembling slightly. She let out a nervous laugh, shaking her head. It had to be a prank. Kids in town were notorious for pulling Halloween pranks, especially on babysitters. It was annoying, but harmless. Nothing to worry about. Still, the uneasy feeling that had been lurking at the back of her mind now surged to the forefront. She glanced around the room, her eyes flicking toward the darkened windows. The wind outside seemed to howl louder, and the shadows in the room felt darker, heavier. Trying to calm herself, Laura turned the volume up on the TV and forced her attention back to the movie. She told herself it was nothing, just some local kid trying to mess with her. But her mind kept wandering. What if it wasn't a prank? What if someone really was watching her? 15 minutes passed, and just as Laura was beginning to relax again, the phone rang once more. This time, the sound seemed to echo through the house, piercing the quiet and sending a jolt of fear through her. Her hand hovered over the phone, hesitation gnawing at her. She knew it was probably just another prank, but her heart pounded in her chest as she picked it up. "Hello?" she asked, her voice quieter this time, almost a whisper. There was no silence this time. Immediately, a low, raspy voice came through the line, sending a chill down her spine. "Have you checked the children?" Laura's blood ran cold. She froze, her grip on the phone tightening as the words echoed in her mind. It was just a prank. It had to be. She forced herself to breathe, trying to steady her racing heart. "Very funny," she said, her voice shaking. "Whoever this is, knock it off." She hung up quickly, her hand trembling as she set the phone back down. She stared at it for a long moment, her mind racing. Who would do something like this? Was it one of her friends? Or maybe one of the kids in town? The house felt different, now darker, more oppressive. The wind outside rattled the windows, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift in the corners of the room. Laura's gaze drifted toward the staircase. Should she check on Tommy and Sarah? She shook her head, trying to shake off the fear. The kids were fine. They had to be. But the voice on the phone haunted her. "Have you checked the children?" The words repeated over and over in her mind, each time making her stomach tighten with dread. Before she could gather her thoughts, the phone rang again. The sharp sound made her jump, her heart racing as she stared at the phone. This wasn't funny anymore. She picked up the phone, her hand shaking. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The same voice, calm and deliberate, whispered back, "Have you checked the children?" Laura dropped the phone, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. This wasn't a prank. Something was seriously wrong. Without thinking, she raced to the front door, locking it tightly. Her eyes darted toward the windows, making sure they were all shut. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her pulse racing in her ears. What should she do? Call the police? Call the Millers? Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Her eyes drifted back to the staircase. Tommy and Sarah. What if something was wrong upstairs? What if the calls weren't just some twisted joke? Laura grabbed the phone, her hands trembling as she dialed 911. Each ring seemed to stretch out, the sound bouncing off the walls of the too-quiet house. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, steady. There's someone calling me, Laura stammered, her voice shaking. They keep asking if I've checked the children. I think someone's trying to scare me. The operator asked a few quick questions, but Laura's mind was spinning. She barely registered the words as she tried to hold herself together. Stay calm, the operator reassured her. We're tracing the call now. Help is on the way. But as the operator spoke, Laura's gaze fell on the staircase once more, her heart pounding louder in her ears. The house felt too still, too quiet. Something was wrong, and she couldn't wait any longer to find out what. With the police on the case, Laura tried to steady her breathing. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up into the darkness, debating whether she should check on Tommy and Sarah. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly ascended the stairs, her footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden steps. When she reached the top, she stood in the hallway, listening for any sound, any sign that the children were in danger. But all was quiet. She peeked into the children's bedroom, her heart in her throat. Tommy and Sarah were fast asleep, tucked under their blankets, completely unaware of the fear gripping their babysitter downstairs. Laura let out a shaky breath, relieved. She quietly closed the door and returned downstairs, feeling a little foolish for overreacting. The kids were fine. Everything was fine. She was just letting her imagination get the better of her. But as she sat back down on the couch, the phone rang again. Her body tensed, every muscle tight as she picked up the receiver. This time, there was no whisper, no breathing. Instead, it was the police. "Laura, listen carefully," the officer said, his voice firm and urgent. "You need to get out of the house right now. The calls are coming from inside the house." The room spun around her. The phone slipped from her hand as her heart pounded in her chest. Her throat tightened, panic taking over her entire body. Inside the house? Without thinking, Laura bolted from the couch, sprinting for the front door. Her hands fumbled with the lock, but she managed to throw the door open and run outside. She didn't stop until she was halfway down the driveway, breathing hard as she glanced back at the houses. Moments later, the flashing lights of police cars filled the street. Officers poured out of their vehicles, storming into the house with their guns drawn. Laura stood frozen, unable to move or speak, her heart hammering in her chest. She watched in horror as they disappeared into the house. Time seemed to crawl. Seconds felt like hours as she waited, her breath coming in short gasps. And then, the officers emerged from the house, dragging a man in handcuffs. He was tall, with unkempt hair and wild eyes, his face twisted in a deranged smile. In his hand, he clutched a knife, the blade glinting in the moonlight. The police found him hiding in the children's bedroom closet. He had been making the calls from a phone upstairs, watching Laura from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Laura felt her knees buckle as the reality of the situation hit her. If she hadn't left the house when she did, if the police hadn't traced the call in time, she didn't even want to think about what might have happened. In the days that followed, the story spread through town like wildfire. People whispered about the babysitter and the man upstairs, how he had been watching her the whole time, waiting to attack. The tale became a warning, especially for young people who babysat in big, empty houses. As for Laura, she was never the same. The fear lingered long after the man was arrested. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the windows brought back the terror of that night. Even now, years later, she still finds herself glancing over her shoulder, afraid that somewhere in the shadows, someone is watching, waiting,